Hey there, I'm David Manthey. I'm a reenactor who, one of my specialties is doing baking. And so we have here an 18th century clay beehive oven. And this is a common oven type that's been around for centuries and would have been at any homestead like this. And one of the things is it's very fuel efficient, so once it gets going, we can bake a long time. I'm going to be doing some different baked goods. I'll be doing a bread and some pastries. I've got here just my setup here, a nice maple cutting board, a bowl, and my spoons and flour and things like that. So what I'm going to do is make a basic dough. This same dough will be used for both a basic bread, like a baguette or a white bread, and also for a base for pastries, a puff pastry or a croissant. And so I'm starting here with just some plain water, just water. I'm going to add a little bit of salt and a little bit of yeast. So this is just a coarse salt. And then I'm using a dried yeast. In the 18th century, there are recipes to dry your own yeast. It looks just like commercial dried yeast to today when you do that. This happens to be a commercial dried yeast, but you could have made your own. You can get yeast from the brewer, but you can use it that way. And then as it sits here, the yeast will begin to soften and foam a little. And that lets me know it's working. And so basic bread requires water, yeast, and flour, and usually requires salt to help control how much moisture it retains. And so what I have here is some flour. It's a little bit of a windy day here, it's not a problem. You can actually do this in pretty much any weather, aside from direct rain on you. In hotter weather or more humid weather, it changes how much water will take up. And so here I've got a very wet dough, and you can see it's frothing from the yeast. I'm going to give that just a little bit of time, not much, just to let the yeast get going. Then I'm going to add more flour. There's different ways to do breads. You can make a wet sponge and let it sit and do most of the rising there, and then add more flour. You can do a dry sponge where you basically add in as much flour as will take right away. We're going to do the dry sponge. If you're fancy, you can use French names for all this to call it a poulache or something like that. We're using fresh yeast, not using sourdough. In the 18th century, sourdough was viewed as possibly something's off, and so people really did not prefer sourdough. We are here in the Mohawk Valley, where we have, in the 18th century, some of the best white flour in the world. And it's grown locally. There's a lot of it. And while you have whole wheat flours available too, everyone in the 18th century knows white flour is better for you than whole wheat flour. Whereas today everyone knows that whole wheat flour is more nutritious. And both these things are true. Until modern silos, whole wheat flour, the outside of flour would tend to get molds on it. And when you grind in the whole wheat flour, that ended up in your flour. Whereas the white flour was basically free of that. And so anyone who could afford it would rather have white flour in the 18th century. And here I'm just adding enough flour to make this dough stiff. I don't have to incorporate it all in the bowl, because most of that's going to be done on the board. So I'm going to put some of my flour on the board like this. Now I'm going to scrape my dough out onto the board. If it sticks to my hands, I can just flour my hands and help it unstick. You can do a lot of variations on this where you add other things to the flour, but this is all the ingredients that are always necessary. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be kneading it. Modern terms, we know this extends the gluten and helps build structure, so it captures the yeast as it rises. In the 18th century, they just knew it worked. There's not much theory that I've seen in literature. There's a fair number of cookbooks in the 18th century. They're mostly targeted to upper-class cooks who are cooking for rich people. There's not any home cooking because they expect most people to have learned from someone else. And it's really the upper-class cookbooks are trying to give additional ideas to make it more interesting for your rich, the person who's hired the baker. So in the 18th century, instead of just calling this white bread, there's different terms for it. Manchette is one of them. And so you'll occasionally see recipes that call for manchette as an ingredient where you're then using it to something else. This would be like saying, just, slice up some white bread to do something. The flour I'm using is an all-purpose flour. In the 18th century, the white flour is slightly different. We have a little bit more of what's called the clear flour, so it would be a little less white than modern white flour, but it's still pretty close. You'll see that I've got a bit of flour and sort of loose dough on this side, so sometimes I'll turn it over to reincorporate that. Depending on how much flour you add, you get different textures of bread. If you have relatively dense, where it's not particularly wet, you end up with something more like a French bread. If you end up with a very slack dough where it's wet, you end up with more like an Italian bread, where it's going to be a lot fluffier. For both my pastries and for something like a baguette, I want that dense effect. So if I feel it can take more flour, I'll add it. I want to knead until the dough is totally incorporated but not tearing too much. And I can see how springy it is. So if I look at this side and I push on it, it bounces out just a little. Maybe I'd like a little more bounce to that, so I'll knead it a little more. And that's better. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stow that in a bowl to let it rise. So I'm just taking my same bowl, put a little bit of flour to prevent it from sticking to the bowl. Put it in my bowl, a little more flour on top. It's really choked off on this in there. So we've raked the fire out, so we've taken out most of the coals. It's not all gone. I've got here a mop that's wet, and I'm going to use this to clean the bottom. And so you'll see it hisses because it's actually vaporizing the water as soon as it hits. And again, this cleans it, but it also adds steam to the oven. You can buy a modern oven that has fancy steam injection to make your bread moister, have a crisper crust as well. Or you can just do this. This comes along free for the process. And so my goal here is to get rid of any live coals, get rid of the ash to keep it cleaner, and basically to humidify the oven to make a moisture environment when I actually am doing the baking. So it's just a matter of trying to make sure I get as much out as I can, because any ash that's left can end up in the bottom of the bread, and I don't want that. Okay, so I've got here my bowl of dough that I had covered, and basically I had set this in a slightly warmer place. It's a cool day. It's risen some, and because I'm going to do this in a very hot oven, it doesn't have to have risen a huge amount. There will be a lot of oven spring to it. And so I'm just going to take this dough and set my bowl aside for now. And I'm going to make sure I have a nicely floured board. We call this punching down the dough, even though I'm actually kneading it. And this is just getting rid of the major air bubbles to let it sort of set, and it will still rise again. It also helps develop the gluten a little further. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this mass of dough and I'm going to divide it into, in this case, 4 pieces, because I'm going to make 4 separate loaves. Ideally, I want these even. If I was doing this in a commercial bakery, my goal would be to have a very specific size, and so you have things like 1-pound loaves and things like that. And if they were particularly uneven, like this one's a little heavy, I can pull off a bit and give it to the other round. So the first thing we're going to do is you're just going to sort of even this up by making it into a ball. And it can be done either by kneading or sort of stretching like this. I'm going to do that with each ball in turn. And so then what I want to do is I want to form these into shapes. So the traditional baguette is actually formed by pressing with your heel or your palm and then rolling it onto itself. This gives it that certain texture inside that you end up being very familiar. I'm not going to make these too long because I don't have a long peel to help me bring them in and out. So that's about the length I'm going to have. I'll call that a bâton, or just a stick of bread. And one of the things is this gets a specific texture. These are going to go in a very hot oven, so this is the first thing. Here I want to be a fairly dense bread and not too big. If I made a great big ball of bread in a hot oven, the center is not going to cook in time for the outside to be totally done. So for your first bread in your oven, you generally want something that's relatively narrow and long, not something with a big round ball. The last bread in the oven, you want that much bigger loaf because it's going to take time to cook and the whole thing has time to cook. So there I have that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give it a few slices. This helps the bread expand, lets it rise more evenly. The pattern one slices into bread is often indicative of the type of bread it is. So if I have different loaves, I can use it as a marker to let me know after it's baked which type of bread it is. And then I'm just going to cover this and let it rise some more. I may move it off this board so I have this board for other things, but that's all there is to it. This just keeps things out of it, prevents the wind from taking away too much moisture, and lets it just rise. Okay, so my oven has had its fire raked out and mop. I'm now just checking its temperature. So I can keep my hand in here about that long before it's uncomfortable, which tells me it's a good temperature for the bread. So I have a door here just to keep heat in, and I've got my bread rising. So I'm going to take that bread and just going to put it in the oven. I'm going to set my door down for now. And then I'm going to go back and get a few other loaves and add those too. The bread's actually done. And so I'm reaching in there because I've done this enough. I can go touch it too long, but that's hot. And I'm going to put my door back in to keep the heat in, and we have fresh bread.